In the final, chaotic weeks of the Third Reich, a cohort of young German women, many of whom had been pressed into service by their own officers as comfort auxiliaries, were subjected to a relentless barrage of propaganda. They were told to brace themselves for encounters with veritable monsters in olive drab. Joseph Goebbels's final, desperate radio tirades painted a grim picture, promising that the Americans would treat them worse than beasts, stripping them of all dignity and humanity. These were not mere warnings. They were calculated psychological assaults designed to instill terror and, paradoxically, to harden resolve against an enemy portrayed as utterly subhuman. Consequently, when the first American Jeep, a symbol of the invading force, finally rolled into view, these women reacted precisely as their indoctrination had prepared them. They clutched blankets over their heads, their bodies tensed, bracing for the worst imaginable fate. What unfolded next, however, was a profound and disorienting departure from the narrative they had been fed. Instead of the expected savagery, a lanky American farm boy, a private from Kansas, simply tossed a chocolate bar onto the ground. Then, with a gesture that spoke volumes through its very silence, he stepped back a full 10 paces. Without uttering a single word, he turned his back, affording them a privacy that had been systematically denied to them by their own regime. The women, bewildered, stared first at the unexpected offering of candy, then at the retreating silhouette of the soldier. In that quiet, unexpected moment of restraint and respect, they realized with stark clarity that the world they had known, the rigid, terrifying reality constructed by the Reich, had just ended. It concluded not with the scream of violence they had anticipated, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible whisper of dignity. This collision between propaganda and reality would, as we shall see, create a cognitive dissonance more powerful than any formal re-education program. For years, the Reich's meticulously engineered propaganda mills had churned out a relentless stream of dehumanizing imagery. Posters plastered across Germany depicted American GIs as grotesque, knife-toothed apes, their features distorted into caricatures of barbarity. Classroom maps, used to indoctrinate even the youngest citizens, colored America in a stark blood-red hue, signifying not just an enemy, but a primal, existential threat. Girls as young as 15, conscripted into the auxiliary forces known as the Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, were explicitly warned of the horrors awaiting them if captured. The threats were chillingly specific. They would be shaved, publicly paraded in humiliation, and then shipped off to North African brothels, condemned to a life of forced servitude. One particularly insidious leaflet, designed to stoke racial fears, swore unequivocally that Negro regiments within the American Army were under explicit orders to assault every blonde German woman they encountered. Another, equally vile, claimed that the Yanks, with a calculated cruelty, injected prisoners with syphilis before releasing them to infect German women. The sheer audacity and depravity of these claims were designed to leave no room for doubt about the enemy's intentions. By the spring of 1945, with the war effort collapsing and the Red Army's documented atrocities in the East becoming undeniable, these stories, however outlandish, began to feel terrifyingly plausible. If the Soviets were capable of such barbarity, the logic went, why should the Americans be any different? This context is crucial, for it highlights the profound psychological conditioning these women had undergone. Indeed, the German leadership, as internal military communications captured after the war would reveal, often projected their own system of military brothels, which had forced an estimated 34,000 women from conquered territories to serve German soldiers, onto their enemies. They assumed the Americans would behave as the Wehrmacht had. Thus, when the truck convoy, prominently marked with PWUSA, rumbled into their makeshift camp near Remagen, the women's knees quite literally buckled under the weight of their terror. They had, in their desperation, rehearsed suicide drills, a grim testament to the depth of their fear. Poison capsules were meticulously sewn into coat hems, and shared razors, sharp-edged symbols of their final option, were hidden in soap bars. What they had not, and indeed could not, have rehearsed was the polite, almost apologetic request that followed. Please form a line so we can count rations. The mundane decency of this command was, in its own way, as shocking as any violence. The first night inside the improvised barbed wire enclosure on the Rhine's west bank was fraught with an almost unbearable tension. Every shadow, every distant sound was amplified by the women's heightened state of fear and expectation. At precisely 2200 hours, the harsh floodlights illuminating the camp snapped off, plunging the area into a relative, though still anxious, darkness. An American sergeant, a man named Billy, whose accent was as flat and unassuming as the Oklahoma plains he hailed from, began his solitary patrol of the perimeter. In a gesture that would be remembered for decades, he pointed his flashlight directly at his own boots, ensuring that its beam never once intruded upon the women's makeshift blanket huts. This seemingly small act of respect was, for many, the first crack in the edifice of Nazi propaganda. Inside one of these fragile shelters, 23-year-old Ing R. whispered a realization that cut through the pervasive fear. He's guarding us, from his own men. This observation was not born of naivete, but of a harsh, recent past. Inga had spent the previous winter servicing signals officers in a requisitioned hotel, a stark environment where doors were never locked and officers never bothered to knock, their access assumed and unquestioned. Now, a complete stranger, an enemy soldier, stood vigilant watch, not to exploit, but to protect, allowing her and the others the possibility of sleep, however fitful. At 400, a deep rumble of engines woke them, instantly triggering a fresh wave of panic. Every woman, conditioned by the brutal realities of war, expected the arrival of rifles, the prelude to yet more suffering. Inga, her heart pounding, cautiously peeked out from her blanket hut. What she saw was not an assault, but 2 deuce-and-a-half trucks, their engines idling, backing slowly toward the camp gate. As tarpaulins were flipped back, revealing their cargo, a wave of incredulity, then a quiet, profound relief, washed over the women. Inside the trucks were crates of U.S. Army blankets, still pristine, wrapped in their protective wax paper. The drivers, with a professional detachment that underscored the non-fraternization policy, simply tossed the blankets down, returned to their cabs, and drove off without so much as a catcall, let alone the wolf whistles or lewd comments the women had been taught to anticipate. The women, many still barefoot on the frosted mud of the camp, clutched these unexpected gifts to their chests. They cried then silently, tears born not of sorrow but of the sudden, overwhelming realization that dignity had arrived, quietly and unexpectedly, even before warmth. 3 mornings later, the captives were marched through the debris of war to a bombed-out textile factory. This shattered industrial shell had been retrofitted with remarkable efficiency and foresight as a shower unit. A hand-painted sign, stark against the rubble, declared, "Ladies only, no GIs past this point." A clear demarcation of respect and privacy. Inside, the women discovered an environment that felt almost impossibly luxurious. Simple wooden benches, soft cotton towels, and, most astonishingly, a single zinc tub from which actual, visible steam billowed. A Red Cross worker, her presence a quiet testament to international humanity, began distributing palm-sized bars of ivory soap. The women hesitated, their ingrained wartime instincts kicking in. Soap, in their old units, had been an unimaginable luxury, typically reserved for officers and often pilfered from occupied French pharmacies. It was something taken, seized, hoarded. Here, it was simply given, freely offered. The Red Cross worker, Herself a German Jewish refugee who had fled the Nazi regime in '37, understood the profound psychological impact of this simple act. She instructed them in a gentle Hessian dialect, a familiar sound that pierced through the official German they had grown to distrust. The water stays hot for 20 minutes. Take your time. Nobody will open the door. Ainge, recalling this moment years later, documented her experience on a scrap of cement sack. She wrote, "I stood under that shower longer than necessary, waiting for the door to burst open. It never did. When I stepped out, I was no longer a creature of the Reich. I was just a cold woman getting warm." This was a pivotal moment, a quiet internal revolution where the physical cleansing mirrored a spiritual and ideological one. The simple act of a private, undisturbed shower, a basic human right denied for so long, began to erode the deeply ingrained Nazi worldview. That same afternoon, the camp's senior American officer, Captain Dorothy Howell, made her presence known. For most of the German women, she was the first female U.S. Army officer they had ever seen, a figure of authority who embodied a different kind of power. During roll call, she conducted herself with an almost deliberate deference. Her eyes were respectfully lowered, a subtle acknowledgement of the women's vulnerability, and she addressed each woman as Fräulein, followed by her surname. This seemingly minor detail held immense significance. Under the Nazis, these auxiliaries had been systematically stripped of their individual identities, reduced to dehumanizing labels like Stützpunktmädchen or base girls, a verbal erasure of their personhood. Now they were Frau Müller, Frau Hoffmann, individuals again, their names restored to them, signaling a return to a recognition of their unique identities. The concept of food, during the brutal years of the war, had been fundamentally transformed. It was no longer simply sustenance. It was currency, a tool of power and manipulation. So, when lunch arrived, sea-ration stew ladled out by teenage GIs who visibly looked embarrassed by their own generosity, the women's ingrained perceptions were challenged once more. The casualness, the lack of expectation, was disorienting. One prisoner, Hilda, instinctively muttered a hesitant "Danke" in thanks for her meal. The shy, almost mumbled reply of "You bet" from the young American soldier startled her. She turned to her companions, her voice a low hiss of disbelief and revelation. "They thank us for eating their food." This simple exchange encapsulated a profound reversal of every wartime lesson they had learned. For years, victuals had been a commodity for barter. Chocolate exchanged for favors, cigarettes for silence, every morsel carrying an implicit cost or expectation. Here, spoons were pressed into palms with no lingering hand on a hip, no suggestive wink, no unspoken demand. It was a transaction utterly devoid of ulterior motive. To further underscore this unfamiliar generosity, calorie counts, a robust 1/800 per day, were conspicuously posted on a chalkboard, alongside a notice that read, "If you need more, ask." This was an invitation that few dared to believe. Several women, driven by hunger but braced for ridicule or refusal, cautiously did ask for more. Instead of the expected derision, the cook merely shrugged, added another ladle to their bowls, and moved on, his action devoid of judgment or condescension. This was not a test. It was genuine provision. Hilda, reflecting on this moment later in her life, pinpointed it as a turning point. "That was the moment," she recalled. "I believed Germany had lost the war for good reasons." It was a realization that the values underpinning the Reich, values of scarcity, control, and exploitation, were fundamentally flawed when confronted with the simple, unadorned generosity of their former enemy. The absence of bargaining, the purity of the giving, began to dismantle the very foundations of their indoctrinated worldview. Within a mere week of their unexpected arrival at the camp, the Americans distributed pencils and field postcards. This act, seemingly administrative, carried immense psychological weight. The rules were clear and surprisingly lenient. Write anything except military intelligence. There would be no reprisals for what was written, and remarkably, the mail would be carried free of charge. Yet, despite this freedom, the women stared at the blank lines on the postcards as though they were vast, unbridgeable chasms. What, indeed, do you tell parents when every previous letter, every communication for years, had been filled with boasts of serving the Führer, of unwavering loyalty to the Reich? How do you reconcile that past with the bewildering present? Inge, grappling with this profound internal conflict, composed 3 sentences that were both a truth and a subtle act of rebellion. I am alive. I am safe. The enemy has better manners than our own. The stark simplicity of her words belied the immense courage it took to write them. She hesitated, undoubtedly weighing the profound implications, then signed the card with her full name, an act that just weeks earlier, under the iron fist of the Nazi regime, would have been punishable by death for someone in her position. It was a reclaiming of identity, a defiant assertion of self in the face of a collapsed ideology. Across the camp, a 17-year-old former Luftwaffe aide, perhaps seeking a connection to a world untainted by war, wrote to her mother, "The Americans gave me soap that smells like before the war. Please send photo of our cat. I want to remember something gentle." These were not grand statements of political awakening, but deeply personal, almost fragile expressions of a yearning for normalcy, for a return to the simple comforts and innocence that had been systematically eradicated by the conflict. The collected cards were left unsealed, a practice that under any other regime would have signaled inevitable censorship and punishment. Yet, no one feared the dreaded black bar edits that had become synonymous with wartime communication. The only oversight came from a bespectacled clerk, an American soldier who merely counted the envelopes, his task purely logistical. Remarkably, Inge's card arrived in Dusseldorf just 6 days later, a speed and efficiency that the Wehrmacht post, even at its peak, had rarely, if ever, managed. Her father, a disabled veteran whose loyalty to the old order was symbolized by the Iron Cross pinned to his chest, read his daughter's words aloud. The unexpected message, the simple affirmation of her safety, and the startling revelation about the enemy's conduct proved too much. He wept, his tears falling onto the cold metal of his medal, a poignant symbol of a world unraveling and a new, bewildering reality taking hold. Mid-April brought not only the promise of spring, but also warm, persistent rain, which, combined with the harsh camp conditions, led to an outbreak of bronchitis among the women. In response, the camp medic, Dr. Leah Schwartz, a New York-born physician who had received her medical training in Vienna, bringing a blend of American pragmatism and European medical rigor, opened a canvas surgery. The women, accustomed to the brutal realities of wartime medical care under the Reich, queued up expecting nothing more than a cursory glance and a rationed aspirin. Their expectations, however, were once again dramatically subverted. Instead of a dismissive inspection, they received private examinations conducted behind hanging blankets, a profound gesture of respect for their modesty and personhood. Questions regarding their health were asked in a whisper, an acknowledgement of their vulnerability and the deeply personal nature of their ailments. Most radically, diagnoses were explained directly to them, rather than being discussed over their heads with male superiors, a common and demeaning practice in the German military. This direct communication re-established their agency, treating them as sentient beings capable of understanding and participating in their own care. When Inge described recurring abdominal pain, Dr. Schwartz, far from dismissing it, scheduled an ultrasound for weeks later at a civilian hospital. This was an unheard-of luxury, a level of personalized and advanced medical care that enlisted women under the Nazi regime could only dream of, often left to treat infections with little more than schnapps and prayer. But perhaps the most stunning sight a true symbol of a worldview shattered and rebuilt, was a bowl of condoms openly displayed on the counter, accompanied by a simple, revolutionary label, "For your protection when you choose." The word choice, both linguistic and bodily, had, almost miraculously, returned to their lives. This was a concept systematically denied to women, particularly those in their circumstances under the totalitarian regime. Hilda, observing this, whispered a sentence that was both treasonous in its implications for the old order and profoundly liberating for her own spirit. "They treat us as if our bodies belong to us." It was a realization of fundamental human rights, a recognition of self-ownership that had been systematically eroded and then violently stripped away. This small canvas tent became a sanctuary where the medical profession, divorced from ideology, served humanity, and in doing so, began the arduous process of healing not just bodies, but deeply wounded souls. May 8th arrived, heralded by the crackle of camp loudspeakers announcing the unconditional surrender of Germany. It was VE Day, the official end of the war in Europe, and with it came General Eisenhower's stern order: no fraternization between Allied troops and the German populace. Yet, that very evening, amidst the lingering tension and the dawning realization of peace, the American GIs performed a subtle, yet deeply significant, act of defiance against the spirit, if not the letter, of that order. Outside the barbed wire separating them from the women's compound, they set up a scratchy gramophone. The volume was kept deliberately low. Its tinny music pointed specifically toward the women's area. The tracks were familiar American swing, Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, melodies of a world the German women had been taught to despise, yet which now offered a strange, comforting rhythm. Then, in a move that underscored their respect and the strictures they operated under, the American soldiers retreated a full 50 meters, turning their backs to the women. They formed a human cordon, not to threaten, but to keep their own comrades, perhaps less disciplined, perhaps less aware of the delicate psychological landscape, away from the women. The women, at first, simply listened, their fear slowly giving way to a bewildered curiosity. Then, tentatively, one by one, they began to move. In the open, under the watchful yet averted eyes of their former enemies, they danced with each other. It was the first time in perhaps years that they had moved freely under the moonlight, without the omnipresent fear of wolf whistles, lewd remarks, or worse. Inga, reflecting on this surreal scene, captured its profound paradox. We waltzed to American music, guarded by American rifles from American boys. If anyone had described this scene to me a year ago, I would have reported them for insanity. At 2300 hours, as abruptly as it began, the GIs shut off the gramophone. They waved once, a quick, almost formal gesture, still without turning around, and then marched away into the darkness. There were no photos taken, no journalists present to record the moment, no morale-boosting reports to be filed. It was an act of pure, unadulterated dignity, performed in darkness, witnessed only by those who needed it most. It was an unofficial, yet deeply effective, demonstration of human empathy transcending the boundaries of war and official policy. Weeks later, the logistical machinery of the Allied occupation began to shift the women. Trucks arrived, prepared to transfer them from their makeshift camp to a more formal prisoner-of-war facility located in France. Before boarding, however, each woman received a paper bag, a small collection of items that spoke volumes about the American approach to their captivity and eventual release. Inside were practical necessities: one fresh uniform dress, new underwear, a toothbrush, simple articles of personal hygiene and dignity that had been scarce luxuries. But the most significant item was a sealed envelope. Inside this envelope was their own camp photo, a head and shoulders shot, taken against a plain white sheet. Crucially, there was no number plaque, no prison stripes, none of the dehumanizing markers typically associated with captivity. On the back, A rubber stamp read, "Returnee Identification, Courtesy U.S. Army." The photo carried no stigma. It was indistinguishable from a civilian passport shot, a deliberate act of normalization. Many of these women, profoundly affected by this gesture, kept these photographs for decades, showing them to their grandchildren while carefully omitting the harrowing wartime context, preserving a memory of dignity rather than shame. Inge, ever the thoughtful observer, tucked her photo inside a worn Bible. In the margin, she penned a poignant, almost theological note. "Image bearer, not conquered flesh." It was a profound statement of self-worth reclaimed, a recognition that despite the degradation she had endured, her intrinsic human value remained intact, acknowledged and affirmed by her captors. As the truck engines revved, signaling their departure, the GIs who had guarded, fed, healed, and even facilitated their dance lined the road. Their eyes were fixed forward, maintaining a strict adherence to the non-fraternization policy, a final, disciplined act of respect. Yet, every woman on those trucks, despite the official distance, felt seen, perhaps for the very first time in uniform, not as a symbol of the enemy, nor as a mere comfort auxiliary, but as an individual. The vast, complex tapestry of post-war Germany slowly began to mend, split into East and West, then rebuilt, and eventually rejoined. Most of the women returned to their hometowns, only to find that the quiet whispers of Ami girls often followed them, branding them as ostensibly tainted by their association with the Americans, particularly by the kindness they had received. They kept silent, a protective quiet that was no longer born of shame, but of a hard-won understanding that dignity, especially in its most fragile and unexpected forms, is often too precious, too easily misunderstood. For public boast or explanation, Inge R., demonstrating a quiet resilience, emigrated to Wisconsin in 1952, seeking a new life away from the lingering shadows of war and judgment. Her sponsor, in a touch of poetic justice, was none other than Captain Dorothy Howell, the same officer who had addressed her with such respectful formality during roll call. Hilda, with a practical spirit, opened a hair salon in Hamburg. Displayed prominently, framing her mirror, was that same palm-sized bar of ivory soap, now hardened and smooth, transformed from a simple commodity into a cherished keepsake, a tangible reminder of the moment her worldview began to shift. Dr. Leah Schwartz, the empathetic medic, returned to Manhattan, where she practiced medicine until her retirement. Her wartime journals, later donated to Columbia University, contained an understated yet profoundly powerful entry regarding the Rhine factory shower unit. "There," she wrote, "humanity bathed itself clean." American Sergeant Billy, the quiet Oklahoman, returned to Okmulgee, raising wheat on his farm, a life far removed from the battlefields of Europe. He rarely spoke of the war, save for one notable occasion at a PTA meeting. In a moment of unexpected wisdom, he shared a profound insight that encapsulated the core lesson of his wartime experience. Privacy is the first right you give your enemy, because if you can give it to them, you can give it to anyone. It was a simple, yet powerful, articulation of the universal applicability of human dignity. History, in its grand narratives, tends to record the monumental, cataclysmic battles, symbolic flag-raisings, the blinding flashes of bombs. Yet, for these 23 German women, confined in a muddy enclosure on the Rhine's west bank, the war, in its most profound and personal sense, ended not with such large-scale ordnance, but with a series of smaller, quieter detonations of humanity. It ended with a chocolate bar tossed from a respectful distance, a hot shower taken behind a locked door that remained inviolate, a tentative dance guarded by the turned backs of their ostensible enemies. Basic human decency, a commodity that had been rationed and denied with brutal efficiency throughout the war, suddenly became the most effective denazification tool imaginable. It worked not through force or re-education camps, but by washing away not just the physical filth of war, but the deeper, more insidious grime of fear and indoctrination. The women who had been conditioned to expect apes found instead guardians. Those who braced for rape received instead respect. And those who anticipated subhuman treatment were handed, with quiet dignity, soap and the profound gift of choice. Inge, decades later, summarized this transformative experience with a clarity born of long reflection. We were not saved by big words, but by small civilities. You defeat hatred not by punching it in the face, but by offering it a towel and saying, "Take your time." It is a testament to the enduring power of empathy, a quiet weapon that, in the most unexpected of circumstances, can dismantle even the most entrenched hatred and rebuild the foundations of shared humanity. If stories like this, of humanity sneaking past hatred, of dignity emerging in the most unlikely of places, move you, I encourage you to hit subscribe and ring the bell. More quiet weapons from history's shadows are waiting to be remembered and brought into the light.